And I think we're ready to get started. So, hello, Humber students. Welcome to summer orientation. Thank you for tuning in. As we know, online experience is still an adjustment for many. And my name is Michelle. I go by the pronouns she, her, and hers. I'm a third year student in the Human Resources Management program with Humber, and I'm your senior orientation leader. Today, I'll be introducing our workshop host, Aaron Brown. He is the coordinator for sexual violence prevention and education for Humber College and the University of Guelph Humber. He's also a graduate of U of T and is currently rewatching Grey's Anatomy in his downtime. Hi, Aaron. Thank you for joining us today to host the What's Your Pleasure? Consent, Sex, and COVID-19 workshop. Before I pass the room over, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, I'd like to ask everyone to ensure your microphone is muted and cameras are turned off. And there will be time during the presentation to share, and we'll let you know when to unmute. If anyone has any questions, please save them or write them down in the chat box for Aaron to address at the end. If you happen to drop out of this call, you can follow the same link you used to get here. I have also placed a link in the chat box to Humber's Code of Conduct, and that way you can see that here. Although we are not currently on campus, we continue to create a respectful learning environment for all, and I would like to note that today's session will be recorded and placed on the orientation website. I'll now be turning my camera and microphone off to give Aaron the room. Over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you folks for joining us today. I am going to pull up some slides, but I did just want to reiterate those housekeeping rules. And so a reminder to keep your camera off and to stay unmuted. For the meantime, you're welcome to share any comments or questions in the chat, and I can address those as we go throughout. And so feel free to post those in the chat. So today we're going to be talking about consent, sex, and COVID-19. Recognizing that, you know, we're in this pandemic right now and it's involving a lot of isolation, but we do have intimacy needs. And so we're going to explore that a bit throughout this session today. Before we do that, I do want to do a land acknowledgement, and I recognize that folks may be learning from all over the world today and joining us. But I want to note that as Humber is the piece that's bringing us all together, Humber College is located within the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Known as Adobegoak, the place of the alders in Michisageeg language, the region is uniquely situated along Humber River watershed, which historically provided an integral connection to Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wyandot peoples between the Ontario Lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay regions. Now home to people of numerous nations, Adobegoak continues to provide a vital source of interconnection for all. And when I do a land acknowledgement, I think it's really important to speak about my own experience on the land as well. And I am someone who grew up with a forest on my backyard and have spent a lot of time, out on the land and engaging in nature. And it's something that I find really restorative for me, especially now that I'm, downtown Toronto, where it's a lot of concrete. Being able to go, by the water is really helpful, or finding green space. And I feel a lot of gratitude for Indigenous folks who have been stewards of this land for much longer than any settlers. And I think that we all have a real responsibility to engage in appropriate usage of this land. I do also want to acknowledge that as part of this conversation, it's about consent, and I'll be talking a bit about sexual violence briefly as well. That I think it's important to acknowledge the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples on Turtle Island, who number in the thousands. And we know that colonization uses violence against women as a tool. and specifically against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people as a tool of colonization. And so I wanted to be able to bring that into this space as well. Before I get into the next piece, I do see that we have a question in the chat. Is it legal to have a girlfriend at campus? Absolutely. As long as you are engaging in a respectful relationship with another person, you are able to do so. You would want to be mindful around what that relationship looks like, and we'll talk a bit about some strategies for how we can engage with one another appropriately throughout this session. So thank you for that question. I did want to chat really briefly about some of the things that we do at Humber College with respect to sexual violence prevention and education, and ways that we really try and foster a campus culture of consent and also prevent any instances of sexual violence. And so we do have our Consent to Education program that we call CPEP. When we are learning in person, we would have 8 student leaders. Right now, while we're learning remotely, we have 2. And they create some different events and initiatives to increase awareness and understanding with respect to consent and sexual violence. We really encourage you to follow us on Instagram at CPEP Team, where we post a lot of great resources, events, and different programming for you. We have our Bringing in the Bystander program, which is a 2-hour workshop that teaches folks about bystander intervention skills. And so thinking about, you know, if we see something happening, how can we take action to address it and ensure that we are all recognizing our responsibility to address inappropriate behaviors on campus or with respect to Humber and in our communities. We provide that in many classes and to student leaders, and so you might actually participate in that workshop as one of your classes, but you also have the ability to request that online through our website. And then we do some different pieces like Take Back the Night, which takes place in September. Typically we would do a march on campus. Again, we're looking at some virtual ways to do that as well, to engage in solidarity with survivors of sexual violence. We do an event called 1 Billion Rising. We have Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So sort of these larger campaigns. And then we also work with some nursing students to do some education. And we have our task force on preventing and responding to sexual violence, where we bring staff, faculty, and students from across the institution to chat about some ways that we can ensure we are providing awareness and education to students, staff, and faculty, and also developing supports that really meet the needs of our students as well. You are welcome to get involved in that task force once the school year starts. And so in September, we'll be advertising and recruiting some students to get involved. So we encourage you to consider that if that might be of interest to you. But let's dive into this consent piece, because that's going to be a big part of our conversation today. And why are we so focused on consent? I think that sometimes folks get really confused about that. And there was this study that was done that found that 96% of Canadians agree that sexual activity must be consensual, which is awesome. I'm like, yeah, I'm glad that almost every single person is on board with that. But that same study found that only 1 out of 3 Canadians really know what consent is. And so folks are saying, we need to make sure that we're consensual, but they're not really understanding all of the components that go into that, which suggests that maybe we have a bit of learning to do still to ensure that we can engage in respectful interactions with one another. And so sexual consent is essential to any sexual interaction that we're having. It doesn't always mean when we're engaging in, penetrative sex, but any sort of sexual activity with another person. We want to make sure that we're being respectful and getting consent for those interactions. So I'm going to go through some elements here for folks, and some of these might be familiar with you and some of them might be new. And you're always welcome to post any questions that you have in the chat. So the element that I think folks are perhaps most familiar with is that consent should be vocal. So it's not the absence of a no, just because someone doesn't say no doesn't mean that they're saying yes to something. And you know, if we think about this in you know, a different context, let's say that someone asks to borrow my phone charger and I don't say no to that, it doesn't mean that they can take my phone charger, right? I need to say, yes, you can use my phone charger for them to be able to borrow it. So we need to make sure that we're getting a clear indication from someone that they want to engage in a sexual activity. Consent is continual, and so it's a process that we are always engaging in. If I consent to some sort of sexual activity with someone one day, it doesn't mean that I'm consenting to it the next day or even later that afternoon. We're always checking in because consent is only for that specific activity in that moment. We want to recognize that folks might change their mind or decide that they don't want to, you know, continue with something, and so they have the right to do that. You know, if I am having a steamy makeout session with someone and then I said like, you know what, I want to stop, I can say, hey, I would like us to stop, and the makeout does not continue, right? Because I don't want to do that anymore, and that needs to be respected. In the same way that if that person didn't want to do it anymore, I need to respect that as well. We want to make sure that we're checking in with our partners throughout, and so we can ask questions like, how is that for you? Are you enjoying this? Right? And those are some ways that we can also make sure that we're getting that consent. And then we need to engage in the ask as we're moving between different sexual activities. And so just because I, you know, have consented to making out with someone doesn't mean that I've consented to giving them a blowjob. And so they would still need to ask for consent before that happens. Consent can be fun. And I think that often when people think about consent or come to these sorts of workshops, they think that it's really stiff and, you know, we have to like in a robotic voice, like, may I touch you here? And there's this real fear that it will like kill the mood. But consent can be really, really fun. We used to bring in a guest speaker who would say that one of the ways he would ask his wife for consent is by saying, what would you like me to do to you tonight? Which I think is so sexy. It's so smooth. And then what's nice is like he knows what she will enjoy. And so they can engage in those activities and he'll know that it'll be a mutually pleasurable experience. So, you know, consent can be this fun process and we can kind of pay attention to someone's enthusiasm throughout that. We should pay attention to some of these nonverbal cues as we're thinking about that. And so, you know, if someone has like their arms crossed or they're not making eye contact, you know, that might be someone who's not super keen on proceeding with that sexual activity. And so we should check in with them before we do anything. Another piece around consent is that it must be sober. And so it can't be given if someone is incapacitated by alcohol or other substances. And that's because those things affect our decision making and they affect our ability to read other people's cues and that sort of thing. And so when we're, you know, consuming alcohol or substances, it might, you know, increase the risk of sexual violence taking place. It impairs our, you know, physical abilities. And so like I can't drive a car if I've had a bottle of wine because like that's too much alcohol in my system. My reaction time is affected. My ability to engage is impaired. And so that's sort of a piece that affects our ability to consent in the same way. People will ask me, you know, what if both people have been drinking? And, you know, this isn't, you know, an algebra where two negatives might make a positive. If we have one person who's intoxicated and can't consent, and we had another person who's intoxicated and can't consent, we just have an even greater likelihood that one or both of these people will have an unwanted sexual experience, right? And so we're not going to proceed with that sexual activity because we want to be respectful of that. It's important to be mindful of some of the cues that might show us that someone is intoxicated by alcohol or other substances. And so, for instance, if I'm slurring my words a lot, my face is really flushed, maybe I'm stumbling, like I've probably had too much to drink, right? My ability to consent is really called into question. And so we're going to play it safe and not proceed with the sexual activity. Consent must be conscious. And so if someone's unconscious, they can't give us that clear yes for any sort of sexual activity. Let's say that I have, some guy sleeps over, and the night before, like, we have this like really great, mind-blowing, perfect, consensual sexual experience. Best of our lives. Amazing, right? Super happy for me. And then in the morning, I'm still asleep and they have slept over and they're in the mood. They can't proceed with any sort of sexual activity while I am sleeping. They might think that because we had this great experience the night before and I consented the night before, that they can try and initiate something and that it'll be really like sexy and fun. But the reality is that in the morning, I might have a different opinion, right? Or I might feel differently about it. And if I'm asleep, can't say, yes, I want to do this. And it might actually be really uncomfortable for me to wake up with someone trying to initiate sexual activity, right? So we need to make sure that someone is in a state where they can give us that consent. Consent is also between peers. And so we can't be giving consent if someone is abusing a position of power, trust, or authority. And so, for instance, as students, you will have professors, and those professors have a position of power over you, right? They control your grades, they determine what assignments you work on, they provide feedback to you, and they might even provide, letters of reference for grad school or something. And so, as a student, there might be a feeling that you have to say yes to any sort of sexual activity with a professor, because of that power that they hold over you, and you might be afraid of what they would do if you say no. And so you can't ever actually give an authentic consent in those experiences. Similarly, like let's say that my boss wanted to engage in sexual activity with me. She controls my pay, she controls what tasks I work on, all those sorts of things. She can fire me if she wants to. There's a lot of power there. That means that I don't really have the ability to say no because I'm afraid of what might happen if I do. If we no longer worked, if I didn't work for her anymore, and let's say that maybe I moved into a manager position, or I stopped working here, or she stopped working here, then that power dynamic is different, and we might be considered peers, in which case we could engage in some sort of sexual activity consensually. But while there's that working relationship between like manager and subordinate, there isn't the ability to consent. Consent should also be clear, and so we're not assuming it or implying it. If we were in person with someone else and maybe we're like being really flirty, I love to flirt, and maybe I'm like winking at someone, that doesn't mean that I've consented to any sort of sexual activity with them. Like maybe I just really, really enjoy flirting. So that person would still need to get consent from me to engage in an activity. They would need to be able to ask me something, for instance. Similarly, I know we're all engaging virtually right now, and so perhaps we are meeting our intimacy needs through virtual means, and so maybe we're doing like a bit of sexting, for instance. Maybe some guy is in my DMs on Instagram and it's getting pretty steamy in our chat. He's sending a little eggplant emoji or a peach emoji. That doesn't mean that a nude can be exchanged, right? Like just because there's that flirtation, there's that sort of conversation happening, there would need to be some sort of ask. And so for instance, if I wanted to show him a nude photo, and maybe I would say like, hey, how about I show you? Because then he would have the opportunity to say like, yes, I would love to see that, or like, no thanks, I've reached my quota of nudes for the week, or that sort of thing. And so there's that ability to consent there, because he might not want to see any sort of nude photo. So there needs to be a real piece of clarity in those interactions. We do need to have consent in our relationships, and just because we've been seeing someone for a period of time, or we're in a committed relationship, doesn't mean that our partners always want to engage in some sort of sexual activity with us, or that we always want to with them. We're not always in the mood, and it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe I just have a stomach ache, right? And so part of being a good partner to another person is checking in with them and ensuring that they want to engage in those sexual activities as well. That's a really valuable part of a relationship. And also recognizing that our sexual needs and interests may change over time. And so still being able to explore that with our partners and have those conversations. And then the last piece that I want to talk about with consent is that it must be given freely. And so it can never be obtained through threats or coercion. And so maybe I have exchanged nude photos or videos with someone, and then they say, if you don't come over and have sex with me, I'm going to share those with other people. That's a threat, and I'm afraid that they might share those things with other people when I don't want them to. And so I might say yes out of that pressure, right? I might feel like I don't have the ability to say no. And so that's not an authentic yes, that's not consent. Similarly, maybe I'm in a relationship with someone and they want to engage in some sort of sexual activity, and they say, if you don't, I'm going to break up with you. We might not view that harm in the same way as some other types of harms, but that's still a threat. They're really trying to pressure me into some sort of sexual activity that maybe I don't want to engage in, but I might say yes because I really value that relationship, right? So that consent isn't authentic. And so we can see how there's actually a lot of nuance in consent and some things that we really need to explore with our partners. I hope that's something that has been really clear throughout this, is that it's not just about our needs, right? And it is important to understand what your needs are and what your boundaries are within any sort of interaction. But we also need to be paying attention to that other person or those other people in any sort of sexual interaction. And that gets us to this place beyond consent, where we're actually getting to a point of mutual pleasure, which is the goal, right? And consent is one of the steps on the way to that. So that's sort of a bit of an understanding of consent for folks. And like I went right ahead, consent isn't the goal, but the bare minimum. The goal is a mutually pleasurable sexual experience, right? And so I think that's always helpful to reiterate for folks. I want to chat a bit about communicating boundaries, because I think that that's a really important piece for us, is figuring out how we do that, but also getting to understand what someone else's boundaries might be. Because we're all different people, we all have different feelings about what we would appreciate, what we would not appreciate. And so we can ask things like, can I send you pictures? Or can I touch you here? What's your comfort level with anal or with oral? What positions do you prefer? Are you open to trying blank? Right? And so we're trying to get a feel for what someone else might enjoy. And in that conversation, we can also share what we would enjoy. And that's a really important foundation for any sort of sexual interaction, is to understand what you would enjoy during that experience, so that both people are satisfied by that and understand what they're going to be engaging in. So this is a really important practice for us to engage in. Some of the ways that we can talk about sex, again, we can think about making it about our partners, not just ourselves. And so maybe instead of saying, I want to touch your blank, we're going to say, how would it feel if I touch your blank? right? That's a way that we're essentially getting consent from that person as well, because we're asking them if they would enjoy that experience. We're getting to understand that person as well. So that's an important piece. We're going to pay attention to body language and nonverbal cues, right? And recognizing that, we might have different abilities or different understandings of verbal cues as well. So paying attention to some nonverbal pieces. Is someone leaning in, pulling you closer, making lots of eye contact? Maybe they're enjoying that experience. Versus someone who's sort of like backing off, pushing your hand away, avoiding eye contact. That seems like someone who's perhaps experiencing some discomfort. And so we're going to check in with them before we proceed with anyone, right? And in fact, maybe we're going to stop because we just feel like, we're not getting enough clarity that they want to engage in that experience. And so let's touch base at another time when maybe they would enjoy it more. And we are going to set those boundaries where we're saying, I like when you touch me here, or I'm okay with this, but I'm not okay with that. Or, maybe we're going to create a safe word that if at any point we feel uncomfortable, we can say that word and we know that the sexual activity needs to stop. So these are some of the ways that we can talk about sex when we're engaging with other folks. Some tips for virtual interactions. We are engaging in the virtual world right now, and so there is risk in meeting up with other people in person, and some folks might not feel comfortable with that. Particularly, I know in Ontario we have the stay-at-home order. We want to make sure that we're asking before we're sending sexual content, and so recognizing that some of the messages we might send or the photos or videos might make someone very uncomfortable. And so getting consent before we're engaging in those sorts of pieces. For our own safety, it's really recommended that you keep your face and identifying features such as tattoos out of sexual photos and videos when possible, or like if you're webcamming with someone. I'm someone who has like a fair amount of tattoos. And so for me, like if I'm ever taking a nude photo or video to send to someone, I'm really having to be like strategic with the angles to ensure that I'm not sharing identifying information that if someone were to share that content with someone else, they wouldn't know that it's me, right? And it's important to note that if someone is sharing our nude photos or videos with other people without our consent, that is a form of sexual violence. That is not acceptable behavior. And it's not our fault for sending our nudes consensually to another person. It's on that person who shared with other people. They hold all responsibility. But if we're wanting to think about some potential harm reduction, this is why we might keep our face or other identifying features out. Because there's no foolproof way to ensure that someone won't share those things without our consent. We should also explore methods that we feel comfortable with. And so thinking about, do we enjoy sending photos or videos? Would we want to do a video call? Maybe we want to engage in phone sex or build some sort of fantasy over the phone. We could use our social media, or maybe we want to request personalized photos to verify someone's identity so that we know who we're actually talking to on some of these apps. And something that we might choose to do is avoid giving out our number or our email and stick with on that app to help maintain some boundaries if we haven't met that person yet, or if we're still trying to get to know that person and whether we trust them. And so, I'm exploring Hinge these days. I'm not giving out my number. I'm only messaging people on Hinge for now because I just don't know enough about them, and I don't know if that's someone that I want to have my phone number. I might not feel safe if I'm sharing that. So those are just some tips that I think are really important for us to consider for these virtual interactions. I'm mindful that while avoiding meeting other people during COVID-19 is one of the ways to reduce the risk of spread of COVID-19 and manage our own safety, we are also folks who have intimacy needs. And maybe we have partners that don't live with us. And so we are going and meeting with other people in person. And I recognize that that plays into our larger wellness. So I did want to share some tips for in-person interactions as well. When we're meeting with someone for the first time, or maybe even the first few times, it can be helpful to meet and stay in public places while getting to know them instead of going to their place, for instance, because we can manage our safety a bit better in these public spaces. There might be other people around that can support us if we get in any uncomfortable experiences. So that can be really helpful for us. We're going to try and stay in control of our transportation both to and from the meetup. And so maybe I'm not going to have that person pick me up in their car or drop me off in their car afterwards, because like maybe they will drive me somewhere else, or there's those pieces around safety where, as we're still getting to know this person, it's a way that we can mitigate our risk. Something that we could do is tell a friend when, where, and for how long we'll be with this person. And so being able to say like, hey, I'm going with this person to Trinity Bellwoods. We're going to head there for 1, and I'm thinking we'll probably be there until around 3, just so they know where we are. And then in that way, in case anything happens, someone has some understanding of our whereabouts. And maybe we arrange a check-in with that friend to say like, hey, half an hour in, can you give me a call and touch base with me? And then like, I'll give you a code word if like I need an excuse to get out, or that sort of thing. We should discuss our expectations and habits relating to the pandemic that we're currently experiencing. And so asking folks about, what social distancing behaviors are they engaging in? Have they been adhering to public health guidelines, like wearing masks, washing their hands repeatedly, limiting their social circles, and those sorts of things? And we need to understand that vaccinations protect the individual who's been vaccinated, not necessarily those around them. We don't know enough about how the virus might still spread after we've been vaccinated, even if we ourselves are protected from it. So that's a really important piece for us to understand. And that even if someone says, I've been vaccinated, that doesn't necessarily make it safe for us to meet with them. So those are just some considerations for us when we're engaging with in-person interactions during COVID-19. Again, I'm mindful that at least in Ontario, we do have the stay-at-home legislation, and so folks are not supposed to be meeting up with other people outside of their household. But the reality is that like our intimacy needs are a part of our well-being. And so if we're choosing to meet up with people, because we know it's also an important piece for us to stay well during this really difficult time, here's some things that we can try and do to manage our safety during those experiences that I really encourage you to consider. And that's it for me. So I want to thank folks for joining in today and tuning in. I don't see any questions in the chat box, and so at this point in time, I want to say thank you so much for listening and attending today or watching this recording. If you have any questions, you can always email us at cpep@humber.ca. Or you can also find us on Instagram at CPEP Team, where you'll find out about a bunch of our events and programming and resources that are available. And then the last place that you can look is also going to humber.ca/sexual assault, where you'll learn about the different resources that we have on campus in the community, our sexual violence policy, and again, some of our programming and workshops that we do. So thank you so much, and I think I will pass it back to Michelle for any closing comments.
Thank you again for your time today, Erin, and to everyone who's watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at orientation@humber.ca, and we'd be happy to help. So if anybody has any questions, you can also email myself. I'm at michelle.cho@humber.ca. Have a great day, everyone. Bye, Erin.